Go.
We believe that improving labor conditions in Foxconn will not hurt Chinese exports. Just to give you guys an overall picture of how Foxconn looks in China, it's a Taiwanese electronics manufacturing multinational corporation, the world's largest maker of electronic components. 40% of the world's electronics are companies such as Apple, Dell, HP, Amazon, etc. There are 13 factories in 9 cities in China. Foxconn employs about 1.2 million laborers in China. It is China's single largest exporter, approximately 8% of exports in 2011 on record. So you can see from this that it has the potential to impact net exports in China. Labor conditions in Foxconn, there have been allegations of poor working conditions. It was made on different occasions. That recently increased in 2012. Low wages, long working hours, underage employment resulting in riots and suicide, protests, strikes. There's a record on suicides in 2010, 18 attempts, and out of 14 deaths out of 18 attempts. Of the 260 strikes in 2012, only 10 attributed to Foxconn.
So China has a comparative advantage in the manufacturing sector and cheap labor. The relationship between labor standards and Chinese exports would be that because they hold this kind of a comparative advantage, increasing labor conditions will increase the costs involved and increase wages for the laborers. It's argued that this will increase this increase in cost will impact the cost of production and hurt Chinese exports. So since we're arguing that Chinese exports won't be hurt, a couple of reasons that we have are first of all empirical evidence. Second of all, that improving labor conditions is going to actually increase productivity and output. And third of all, the idea of brand reputation by its customers, and fourth of all, repercussions of not improving labor conditions can be higher.
So first of all, we would like to look at the empirical evidence regarding the relationship between labor standards and export performance of a country. And a study by Michael Bono in 2009, which analyzed the effect of labor standards on export performance using a sample of 112 countries, 70 low-income out of them from 1980 to 2004, results that higher level of labor standards and better institutions have a positive effect of export performance, and that countries with better labor standards and institutions do trade more. The exports to GDP are higher. And other studies also support this argument. Gawley in 2001 concludes that higher labor standards lead to high rate of economic growth. Martin Marcus in the paper also stated that weak labor standards reduces efficiency, and that higher level of labor standards generate productivity gains, raise competitiveness, and improve trade relations between countries. Another study by Kuchera and Sarna in 2006 also promotes the use of core labor standards, which is associated with higher trade performance.
Just to give you guys an idea how improving labor conditions increases output can look in theory, if you look at this diagram, what Marcus Martin assumes, he assumes that in such a disequilibrium case when W dash is below the equilibrium wage, so when this is a discrimination wage, so as you increase wage by increasing labor conditions, let's say this is the case of Foxconn. In the case of Foxconn, if you increase wages, your wage rate is going to go up, and if you operate on the labor supply curve, that's the short side of the economy, you'll see that the output goes up, efficiency level goes up, and competitive. Hence, he concludes, Marcus Martin concludes that efficiency, competitiveness, output goes up as wages go up. So this is so we can see an increase in wage rate can be directly translated into exports as efficiency and productivity in a company or in a country in general goes up.
So a major concern that that Foxconn's customers such as Apple have is their brand reputation. Ethics, the idea of ethics and high labor standards has put a lot of pressure on Foxconn and Apple especially. This pressure has made Apple pledge that they will improve the labor standards in Foxconn. And for example, Nike in the 1990s had concern for workers in developing countries and unfair trade advantage. They had to improve their labor conditions and move their factories to address this problem of brand reputation.
To understand why repercussions of not improving labor conditions are, to understand how, if labor conditions are not improved, we need to also see what the repercussions of not improving labor standards are. As we read in the Cambodia case, it was greatly questioned. Cambodia's reason of signing the bilateral treaty with US was greatly questioned because Cambodia, like China, had a comparative advantage which focused on the low labor costs. But hence, still it signed the treaty, which was globally questioned. China has a similar problem. There is the possibility of imposition of trade tariffs and trade sanctions. Charles Schumer on the Legislations Committee, the senator, has given percentages between 20 and 40 of possible imposition of possible trade tariffs if China does not improve its labor conditions. The other important thing is that the global institutions like WTO and international labor organizations have scrutinized China repeatedly, and Chinese improvement of labor conditions will be a global acceptance of China in these labor institutions, in these global institutions, hence impacting China's trade agreements with other countries as well. Also, strikes, riots, and other problems that are being caused by these labor conditions, because of these low labor conditions, are reducing efficiency and output. And if China addresses the issue of labor conditions, if Foxconn, for example, addresses the issue of labor conditions, it will improve its efficiency and output. One of the biggest counter-arguments of our opponent has been that the direct impact of this improved labor condition will be on the increased cost of production. Hence, this will directly impact the exports of China. We would like to address this by first pointing out how low-wage costs are becoming decreasingly important. That is less important because labor represents only a small part of the overall cost of making and selling their products. We will see this in the picture that follows. Secondly, Foxconn is planning to use more robots for assembly work in China to reduce labor costs and bring in more computerization and increase the automatic procedures for making the products. And this will be an industry-wide phenomena, and the companies have to decide how much they pass on their customers versus how much cost they end up absorbing.
So this is the diagram that shows how the cost of each of the production of the iPad. And so, as you can see, that China's labor cost only accounts for $8 out of $499 of the iPad, so which is a pretty small percentage.
The second counter-argument is, as Sidra had mentioned earlier, China has a comparative advantage which is addressed in the low labor cost because of the high population and low skilled labor. As our opponent said, increasing labor costs, China will lose this comparative advantage. We would like to mention that the comparative advantage lies not only with the low costs of labor, but also because China has, in the last 30 years, managed to build a huge manufacturing industry, and this industry it includes obviously the low labor costs, but it has equipment, land, property, etc., other things that contribute to China being a leader in the manufacturing industry in the world. So the cost of production may increase when it comes to wages, etc., but the comparative advantage will remain within China because they have other benefits from the large economies of scale they have been able to attribute to their manufacturing sector in the last 20 years. If Foxconn, if Apple and other customers of Foxconn intend to change base of production from Foxconn, they will be looking at other manufacturing countries with low labor costs such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, and this means that they will shift their base of production from China. They will encounter several problems which we feel outweigh the costs of staying within China, and we'd like to address these. For example, there's a huge cost that just results from shift in the industry. So, for example, they will have to buy all the assets again. They will have to come in terms with contracts with the new countries they're going to be entering, and those are substantial costs and problems, and will take time. And Foxconn industry has products it makes are required more frequently than we can imagine. So the time they will waste is going to be a huge cost and huge burden on their on Apple, etc., and all these other companies that intend to move away from Foxconn. The other problems they they will incur are inadequate infrastructure, lack of skilled workers, which they'll have to train again, and even political problems such as corruption. Also, the countries they choose to go to, they will have to address these labor conditions all over again because Apple, because of its brand reputation, the media will move with it. So, for example, if it goes to Vietnam, it will have to hire a company that is paying its laborers an unquestionable amount of wages, etc. So, again, there's a huge question on how much cost of production will actually decrease, and is it worth it for them to shift?
So in conclusion, a wage increase due to improvements of labor conditions will not hurt exports. We've covered basis of the fact that increasing labor standards will increase human capital as well as labor productivity. This is because, as already mentioned, if labor conditions are improved, then laborers will be happier and more satisfied. For example, if they have better housing or if they have better wages, they're going to be more satisfied, and this will also address the problem of that Apple was having of having scratches on their products. If the labor conditions are improved, labor productivity will be improved due to happiness. And second of all, the point that we addressed earlier about moving from labor intensive to capital intensive, this means that if they shift their production process by making robots, for example, make more of their products, this will also in turn increase efficiency and output, and therefore will not hurt exports. Second of all, Foxconn, it's very difficult for Foxconn customers to be able to find suitable substitutes in other countries because due to the brand reputation of all of its big customers, they will take with it the requirements of high labor standards, and because of this, they will have to start from scratch, and they're going to have to improve the labor standards. They're going to have to build an industry that China built for 30 years, and this will take time, and therefore it's not feasible. Last of all, wages constitute for a very small portion of the production cost, as we saw in the diagram that Hien showed. It's only $8, and therefore, if $8 is increased to $9, it doesn't have such a huge impact on the cost of production. And so, for all of these reasons, we think that improving labor standards in Foxconn will not hurt exports. Thank you.